Guild Wars 2 is a little bit different than other MMOs in terms of how to find the correct composition for your party or your squad. In this video I want to explain to you, detailed but still concise, how Guild Wars 2 squad and party composition works and what you have to take care of when building your own composition, or just joining a group and what is necessary when you fill a specific role. As always, special shout out to all my supporters that help me keep the lights on. And now, without much further ado, let's jump straight in. So first I want to explain that in other MMOs, you typically have the healer role, you have the DPS role, and you have the tank role. In Guild Wars 2, in most content, there is only like 3 roles that you need. So what am I talking about? Of course, you have the DPS role. Pretty self-explanatory. This is the role where you just have to deal damage the most that you can, and the only really job that you have is dealing damage. Of course, you could help your party with other stuff, but that's your main role. That's what you want to do. Play builds that are very selfish, just provide a lot of damage to the party. The second role is also somewhat self-explanatory. It's the healer. You have typically in most groups, you want to have at least one healer. We will get to that in the later section of the video when not and how to change that. But the important part is the healer provides healing, of course. But in Guild Wars 2, the healer is not only providing healing and that's it. No, you also provide boons, very specific and very important boons. So as the healer in Guild Wars 2, you also have to be aware that you provide 100% quickness or alacrity for your subgroup. So yourself and for other people. Most supporters can do that. That's the important part. And you are either a quickness healer, so quick heal, or alacrity heal. One of those two. No build can upkeep both of them permanently. So this is the first distinction. Healers can be either quickness heal or alacrity heal. Both of them fill the same slot mostly, but you have to pair with another supporter depending on what kind of boon you provide. Before I go into more detail about the healers, I want to mention the third role as well, which would be, so to say, your counterpart. So when you're the quickness healer, you want to have an offensive supporter that provides alacrity. So you always have alacrity and quickness for the whole party. If you are an alacrity healer, you want to have a quickness DPS. That means that you are full DPS build that also provides 100% alacrity or quickness uptime for its subgroup. And this DPS has obviously a little bit less DPS than a full DPS build because you try to upkeep this boon, but most builds actually can provide it quite easily without too much of gear changes in comparison to a typical DPS build. So the 3 roles would be offensive supporter, defensive supporter, which would be the healer, and the DPS. In Guild Wars 2, there is not a real tanking role. There is no specific class or encounter design in that way where you need to have a 4th role, which would be the tank. There is only in raids, some encounters and in strike missions where you want to have a tank. The tank, however, is not specifically decided beforehand. The tank can be either by fixation, so the boss chooses a random target that it will follow, or some bosses have toughness-based tanking. So that means the player with the highest amount of toughness as their stats will be the tank. And typically in most encounters you don't have a specific player that is only the tank and does nothing else. No, you typically assign this role to a healer. So the healer gets the job of being the tank and the healer, while also being the boon applier. So the healer is typically the mechanic caretaker. Before we go into more detail about all the supports and what they actually have to do as their job, I want to remind you, if you like this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for way more content like this. But now let's go and talk about what is actually required of you if you're playing a supporter in Guild Wars 2. So like I said, the offensive support is pretty straightforward. The offensive supporter typically needs to deal damage and provide 1 quickness or alacrity boon permanently to its subgroup. This is it. That's how you fill this role. Of course, it is nice if you have some utility in the kit as well, but your main role is doing quickness or alacrity permanent for your subgroup while also dealing damage. The healer is way more flexible. The healer needs to heal, of course, but also provide the boons like quickness and alacrity, one of them. And that's the important part, together with the offensive supporter, they have to provide 25 stacks of might, fury, protection, if possible, vigor, resistance, resolution, H's, stability, of course. So all the good stuff has to be provided on top of that. So in an ideal scenario, the offensive supporter and the defensive supporter together provide all the boons permanently, if that's possible, for all your party members. This is what the 2 roles together have to work out. So some healers can provide more boons than other healers that can only provide a little bit of boons. And then you have to fill them up together depending on the need of your subgroup and the encounter mechanics, of course. The important part here is that some boons can be not as strictly necessary, for example, resolution or resistance, but might, fury, quickness, alacrity, those boons are like 100% necessary all the time. You don't want to drop those ever. So keep that in mind. If you can't upkeep that, either find someone, DPS player, some other player in your party that actually provides enough of that. You don't want to have times where your might drops to 15 stacks. That is a huge DPS loss for your party, never have that. So let's go to some more advanced tips. Supports in Guild Wars 2 do not only fill the healer role and the boon providing role, but they also typically are the first to take care of mechanics. So what do I mean by that? A lot of raid fights, strike fights, even fractal fights have some kind of mechanics that you need to do. Supporters typically are the first ones to do those, and the important part is a lot of the mechanics can be dealt with by using specific utilities, specific traits, specific pets, whatever. There's always some way to actually deal with it. So let's list a lot of stuff that actually happens here that can be useful in this case. So of course, one of the most common ones is CC. So crowd control. Defensive supporters should always be the first to adjust their utility skills, maybe even their weapon skills and traits to get more CC out. But that's quite common already that a lot of supporters have good CC in their kit. Even offensive supporters typically have an easy time to swap out 1 or 2 skills, maybe a weapon, to go for a little bit more CC while losing a little bit of DPS. That's always a big thing that you should do if you are one of the supporters. In some cases where a lot of CC is needed, even the DPS should actually adjust their build to actually provide more CC if that's the thing that your squad is struggling with. But you are, so to say, the last that adjusts it. Another special case would be Reflect. Sometimes fights need a Reflect. Good example would be Matthias, or even in Fractals, sometimes Reflects are really good. Not always necessary, but in raids, sometimes they are actually necessary. So that means that you actually have to bring a Reflect. If you don't have a support that can do that, then of course a DPS can slot that in as well. But typically a support has an easier time slotting that in, or even has that in baseline kit. Then next thing would be, of course, Condi cleanses. A lot of supporters have this baseline, but if this not enough, sometimes it's good to bring in more Condi cleanses for a fight. And sometimes it's even better to have own Condi cleanses if you know you will do a mechanic where you are alone as a DPS and you will get Condis. Then having a cleanse on there is worth it. And the last thing, of course, would be specific mechanics that are very specific to a fight, where you have to do, for example, a lot of running around, where teleporting or super speed can be useful. Sometimes you get CC'd in a fight, then you need a stun break. Sometimes invulnerability is good for a fight, if you, for example, the hand kite on Demos. There are many things that come in handy if you are a specific role in a specific fight. But I can't cover all of them, and just this is some kind of overview. Just keep in mind, CC, cleanses, sometimes barrier and reflects, all that good stuff can be helpful. Just know when to use it. And this is, so to say, always the supporters are the first to actually adjust their build, and DPS comes last, but might still be worth it to adjust it. Don't say, I'm DPS, I will always play the same build. Adjust it if the group is struggling or if you need to help them. So now let's talk about the composition building element. So in Guild Wars 2 there are two, let's say maybe 3 different PvE instance or open world scenarios. So either you are in a 5-person group, you are in a 10-person group, or you are in a 50-person group. That's the typical split. The 50-person group, I won't go into detail there because it's exactly the same as for the 10-person group or the 5-person group, just in a higher scale. The important part is every single boon that you provide typically is only to yourself and 4 other people, if you have that. That means that you always build squads and party compositions around 5 people, and for a squad you build them around 2 times 5 people. So you have 2 parties that are just come together and play together the encounter. Typically they don't interact too much with each other. There are some exceptions, we will get to that, but the first really important thing is that you have 1 healer, 1 offensive supporter and 3 DPS in every single party. That's the typical squad composition, or for Fractals and Dungeons, for example. Of course, that's the important part. For Fractals and Dungeons, sometimes you even drop the healer and go for another offensive supporter. Or if you are in Dungeons and speedrunning, sometimes you only play 5 DPS and provide a little bit of quickness in the beginning, and that's enough to kill the boss very fast. So there are some specific cases where you don't need a healer, for example, or you want to play some kind of Celestial healer. Be sure to check out my Celestial healer playlist, because those are really good in Fractals, for example, where they can also provide some DPS, while not as much healing as necessary. Stuff like that is some specifics, but in most cases you have 1 healer, 1 offensive supporter and 3 DPS. And the same goes for raids and strike missions where you have 10 player content. There you have just 5 players that are exactly built like the same party compositions for Fractals and Dungeons, just you mirror it for the second subgroup. However, for raids and strike missions, sometimes it's enough to have only one healer. So you would have one healer for all 10 people. This would be one healer in one subgroup. You have one offensive supporter in that subgroup and 3 DPS. And in the other subgroup, you would have 3 DPS and 2 offensive supporters. Because sometimes the healing pressure on a fight is not high enough to really require one healer in each subgroup. That means that this only healer in the fight can heal enough for both subgroups, because when all players in one subgroup have maximum health, you will heal the second subgroup. Even if it's not in your subgroup and the priority target would be your own subgroup, it will target the other allies that might need healing. Some defensive supporters can provide permanent alacrity, for example, to 10 people if the party splits accordingly, and you can also heal. That is some very high-level advanced gaming. This is not really happening in most PUC scenarios and stuff like that, but be aware this can be the case. Typically, you want to have one alacrity, one quickness provider in each subgroup. Doesn't have to be defensive supporter in both of them, but at least one healer in a 10-person squad is typical. But the most common way is, like I said, 2 healers, 2 offensive supporters, and 6 DPS, split across 2 subgroups. And when it comes to tanking, you typically only have one tank, and this would be one of the defensive supporters. So in most cases, in raids, you would have one defensive supporter that is also the tank, therefore has the highest toughness. Then you have one offensive supporter with it and 3 DPS in the same subgroup, while you have in the second subgroup 3 DPS, one offensive supporter and one defensive supporter that has lower toughness than the first tank and therefore is not tanking at all, in most cases at least. Of course, there are some encounters where you have specific mechanics that you need to take care of, which can be filled by DPS roles, by healers, whatever. Like kiting mechanics, like negating some attacks, whatever. This is just the most basic squad composition guide that you could get. So if you have any questions, please let me know down in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks again to all my supporters. Really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video.